I probably do want to put a provocation out to us and also to the panel that, you know, ladders are linear, aren't they, really? They go up and they go down, but humans aren't like that at all. And I suppose the complexity of measuring humans can be quite arbitrary. So I think it's really important that this conversation brings the humanity and the empathy aspect to it, which we will bring to life. And I think, you know, Tamika is a great start to that around, you know, for women and children, how do you bring those voices to the table in understanding the needs and what that might look like?
So in terms of bringing our voices to the table, I think the biggest thing that we should speak about is obviously co-design, but then in terms of when we have our, I'm not sure what the correct terminology to use here would be, but I'm just going to call us clients as people that come into a homeless service, because you just feel that way. You don't feel anything as you do feel a client. So in terms of when you have someone who is a client or someone who is experiencing homelessness come into a service, do we sit there and do we ask them what matters to them, what looks successful in terms of housing for them, what is safe for them, what does success look like for them, what in 12 months' time, what would a successful support from our service look like from you, and where would you be in this period of time? And then stepping back from there and going, okay, so this is where you see yourself in 12 months. How can we work within this next 12 months together as a partnership to make that happen, rather than having someone come into your service and saying, hey, we know how to do this. It's A, B, C, D. Help me do it. Like, you know, instead of being led to do something, let us do the leading. Let us explain to you what we need. We still may need a little bit of guidance along the way, but we don't need to be led completely. We need to be able to communicate what we believe we need as well, because as someone that is homeless, as someone who is experiencing homelessness, everyone's experiences are different and everyone's needs are different. So having this one shape to lead us can give us an idea, but we need to individualise everything. And to individualise that, we need to actually come to those people and sit them down and go, how do we do this? What are the goals that we need to achieve? What are the steps we need to take, and how can we work together to do those things?
People rather than process perhaps at the forefront. And to bring in others like Corin and Katie, what do you see around the voices of people and the stories, and how you bring those out with lived experience in trying to measure outcomes or develop your frameworks or even the advocacy elements to that? Corin, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. And maybe I'll start by saying I'm a data nerd. So my go-to is always, what does the data tell me and how do I use that to explain a problem to somebody and help them understand the solution and the impact that can have. But despite that, what I've seen really powerfully through the work that we've done at the Foyer Foundation is that you need both the data and the stories, and you need to bring them together, because some people make decisions based on emotions, and some people make decisions based on facts, and some people make decisions based on both. And so you have to have both, I think, to be able to tell your story of impact in an effective way to a diverse range of audiences. And perhaps one other thing I would say, when you're using data as part of your attempts to have impact, I think you have to keep it really simple in the communication. I think there needs to be sophistication behind your measurement so it can stand up to colleagues in Treasury who will kick the tyres very, very hard. But I think if you overcomplicate the communication of some of the data in your story of impact, you don't get very far.
Great advice there. Measure what matters, hey? Katie?
Thank you. I don't think I need to sell anyone on the value of lived experience based on, you know, what we've already heard here today. And I think when we're talking about outcomes measurement and we're looking at the analogy of a ladder, you know, looking at a ladder on its own without the person's engagement with that ladder just isn't meaningful. It's a ladder. You know, it exists for a purpose. So if we take the purpose out of it, we take the meaning out of it. How we do that, though, in practical terms can be tricky. It's hard to sometimes incorporate those stories in our routine, everyday outcomes measurement. And I think that's where evaluation becomes really important, and we need to be intentional about how we bring that in. And doing evaluation gives us the opportunity for those deeper dives to understand both how we can improve what we're doing, but also to understand what's working and why and how, so that we can scale it to other locations. And at the moment, we're working with the Lady Musgrave Trust on a housing project in Logan, which you've heard a little bit about today. And as part of that, we've engaged an evaluation and learning partner to actually join us from the get-go throughout that experience, so that we are having lived experience right from the ground and throughout, so that we're constantly learning and keeping people at the centre of what we're doing.
And perhaps, Rebecca, just on that point, because you've done an evaluation for Common Ground as well, so perhaps maybe we just sort of segue to that and give a little bit of exposure to that before we jump back again.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think we worked with Sue from Common Ground, who you heard from earlier today, and her team, and looked at the long-term outcomes of the supportive housing model when compared to the traditional social housing model for those that were experiencing chronic homelessness and had multiple needs that needed support to navigate, and the quantum of impact that would have in a positive way, with a financial dollar figure associated to the system overall over time. So the reduction in dollars spent over a 10-year period by the government that would no longer be required, because they were provided those services and provided that housing, as well as the for that individual, the cost, just even from a financial perspective, even before you start obviously to think about the many, many other benefits that we've spoken about today. I think it was excellent to go through and quantify each aspect of the service and why they were important, to help articulate that message to others in a way that said, these things are not just nice to have when we talk about supportive housing, they're fundamental to actually moving the dial and creating that long-term change over time. I think the one trick we might have missed though with that, and Sue, I don't think we've actually discussed this, but and reflecting on the comments so far, is the measure that we put was probably a little bit too complicated. So it was a very economic, academic kind of figure, like dollar figure put towards the saving to the system. And it was a 10-year number. And we know that when we're talking about government and when we're talking about funding, we often look in a political term, and 10 years is tricky. So how do we get the right combination where we're still working towards that 10-year outcome or 20-year outcome, that long-term cycle breaking, but actually when we think about the rungs on the ladder, like there's what's the indicators that are along the way that can still demonstrate that progress, and know we're moving towards that overarching outcome in a way that considers each participant. Yeah.
Fabulous, and an example there, I suppose, of balancing the complexity with the simplicity of the message as well. And I think the Zero project has done an amazing job in trying to cut through that, with its advocacy and with the evidence base that it's approached. Paulina, do you want to give us a little bit of an overview around, what you're seeing there from what you've learned about the shifts and what works in shifting homelessness? And I'd be interested to really hear the latest information that you have there, and how has that data helped with advocacy as well?
Well, what has been working for Brisbane Zero is, the first thing is a collaboration across sector towards achieving the goal of prevent, reduce, and solve homelessness in our community, but doing this through a data-driven approach. So it's knowing people experiencing homelessness by name, but also knowing people's needs. And after that is, what is the data telling us? Because that data is also about human experiences. So this is to make sense about what is happening in our community, to advocate for system change, but also for making informed decisions. And for example, we know as of today, we have 479 families experiencing homelessness on the by name list. The most of them are in motel accommodation, with more than 800 of children. So the Brisbane Zero data has been helping us to make those people visible. Unfortunately, I was listening the panel before, and I realized this disconnection between the housing data and the homelessness data, because more than 45% of those families in motels have more than 2 children. So, yeah.
Some incredible figures there, and it has been a theme of the day around hotels and the impacts that's having across a whole range of systems. So, Katie, from your perspective, getting to know people housed is part of the picture, but it's not the end of the story, of course. So how do we know we're doing what it takes for people to stay housed long term? And what sort of indicators do you see around the likelihood of outcome for that?
Sure. So one of the things that we do is actually check in with people after we've successfully supported them into a new housing space or help them to stabilise the housing that they're in. So we have designated check-in points at 4, 7 and 12 months sort of post-service, so that we are able to monitor the sustainability of those outcomes, but also, and perhaps more importantly, intervene if a tenancy is starting to get a bit wobbly before it completely collapses. So in that process, we're both monitoring the data, but we're also, helping to sustain along the way through that process.
And if you're not having those touch points as, a person's stability, goes along, how do you sort of understand, measuring success if those sort of touch points drop away over time?
I think it is hard, but one of the things we can look to is some of our national data around specialist homelessness services. And I'm not sure what the latest figures are, but last time I checked it was, at least 50 or 60% of people that re-enter the service system within like a 5-year period. So we know that actually a lot of housing outcomes aren't sustainable in the way that the current system is operating. And Tamika, from your perspective, I mean, what does success look like for you from a tenancy perspective and a stable housing outcome?
For me, success looks obviously more than transitional housing. It looks like having somewhere that you're secure and comfortable within that environment, but that you also have the ability and the supports around you to maintain that. A big difference for me in my housing was, although I was with my housing support provider, I also had a youth worker who was working alongside me before that journey and worked alongside me after that journey. So there was someone who was linked in with me that when that housing stopped, they didn't stop. And I think that's a really big thing to have and really important to have, that in that cross-section that we normally only have tenancy workers connected to our tenancy, and we don't have someone that can support outside of that. But for me, success, it looks like being able to move into a house, being able to sustain that with the supports around you, and being able to come back and ask for help when needed. So if you transition out, knowing that 3, 4, 7 months down the track, having someone come and will check in on you, that's a success. But knowing that you can come back to a service, even if your transitional housing wasn't necessarily a success, is a success. Achieving the goals that we identified at the start. So I think that's a big thing, is breaking down the difference between our goals and service goals. So a goal for us might be to gain the next step of housing, but it also might be to gain jobs, to do this, to do A, B, C. And that successful housing transition can look not like obtaining the housing, but it could look like obtaining the job, obtaining this, obtaining that, and then obtaining the housing. That's still successful. But ensuring that we support along that journey and that we don't stop because our service has stopped. So ensuring that within our service, because we're a 3-month service, because we're a this month's service, because we're a that month's service, that we don't stop at that point and say that this is success because where we're at with this person is success. Because you, like Katie states, that they have they have checks after. So being able to come back and say, okay, now that, you know, we've stopped at 12 months and this is success, what looks like for success is, you know, sustaining the housing. We've got the goals achieved that we identified at the start, but then coming back and being able to say, okay, is this still successful?
Some great observations, and there's a lot of conversation around at the moment in relation to funding and you know, support services, and if you are tracking through whether it's a social or then you've been able to step up the ladder and you go to more of an affordable type of arrangement, you know, why do you have to shift houses, or how does the system navigate that to facilitate stability in the tenancy rather than, you know, a spreadsheet looking at things going, well, this facility is for these type of people, and it needs to be much more dynamic. And I think the system's starting to, I suppose, flex a little bit more around that. But Corin, you've done some amazing work in, I suppose, you know, sending really clear messages to all ranges of governments, and I probably acknowledge I do sit on the Foyer Foundation board, so I'm here to cheer as well. But I suppose understanding that return on investment for housing and support provides, you know, compelling evidence. And how did you sort of, I suppose, monetise the dollar value around that impact, or use that sort of evidence base to advocate?
Maybe let me start by answering that in two quite conflicting ways. You know, I think at one level, you actually can't put a price on the impact that you can have through a service like a youth foyer or some other form of supported housing that a young person or indeed anyone gets. And I think, you know, anyone that listened to Caitlin up here on the stage, you know, talk about her experience in the foyer and now be here in front of you all, you know, sharing her expertise as a youth worker, like, you can't put a price on that sort of impact and outcome. But at the same time, you have to, you know, to get any funding out of government and particularly Treasury, you have to be able to put a price on the value of the investment that government gets in any service. And I think you have to do that in a number of ways. I think you have to make it simple, as I touched on earlier, but it still has to be robust. I think when you're talking to Treasury colleagues, you have to think really hard about the payback period. And that's complicated because actually the payback period is over someone's life, and that's entirely legitimate. But most of the time, Treasury only cares what gets printed in the budget papers, so they're interested in a 3 or 4 year period. So when we looked at the impact of Foyers, we worked really hard to understand what was the impact over the short term, over a 4 year period. And we were able to say to government, very simply, for every dollar you put in, you get $6 back, and your payback comes in 4 years' time. And that gets Treasury colleagues feeling much more relaxed, and indeed we've seen the outcome of that in Queensland with their wonderful commitment to 8 new foyers. But I guess the way you get to that figure of $1 in, $6 back is by looking at, you know, how do you change somebody's life, and how do you then understand how they interact with services under one scenario versus another. Now, that can be really hard, and we face some challenges in doing that in the under one roof work, because you have to make assumptions about, well, you know, what might a young person's pathway be like if they are not in a foyer, and, you know, particularly in a sector that needs a lot of strong and different responses to young people when they experience homelessness. I think we inadvertently got ourselves into trouble in comparing a young person's trajectory to a young person that perhaps might be accessing other forms of specialist homelessness services. So I think you need in Treasury speak, you need a counterfactual, which means, you know, what is the alternative scenario that might exist here if a young person doesn't access a foyer? And then you need to stack and quantify the costs that young person might incur, I guess, by going down a different pathway. So how much less likely are they to interact with the justice system? How much less likely are they to interact with the health system? How much more tax do they pay when they get a job as an outcome of getting a good education? How much less do they rely on welfare? And that's how you get to the dollar figure. What that dollar figure doesn't include when you are trying to make a case to Treasury or trying to look at the short-term payback period is actually the intergenerational impact you can have through a positive intervention in somebody's life. Treasury doesn't like you to count those. They don't, it's too far in the distance for them to care about. But actually we heard on the stage earlier that, what was it, like 50% of young people that present to homelessness services have had parents who were also experiencing homelessness. So those effects are absolutely real, and if you included them in your dollar figures, it would be even more of a no-brainer to invest in almost any sort of early intervention program for a young person, or indeed even earlier. And that's where I get quite frustrated at conversations with government officials who say, well, we can't afford to put more into supported housing solutions. And I guess my answer is, you can't afford not to. If you look at the return on investment in the short term, let alone the long term, it's actually just really poor investment decisions on the part of government to not put money into things like that.
Challenging when those buckets are competing for a whole range of other infrastructure aspects, I would say. I was going to say Olympics, but I didn't want to go there today. We'll put that one to the side. Was there one particular thing that really cut through, or was it a suite of measures or narrative? As you've said, it's coupling the stories with the evidence. But do you think there was, particularly when you're going around the halls of Parliament and doing those sort of, pitches, what do you think was the big, the hook?
I'm going to say there was 4 things in our story that we just repeated over and over again and that were compelling. It was how many young people go into safe and stable housing when they leave a Foyer, how many young people are in employment and or education when they leave a Foyer, the $6 return for every dollar you put in, and the 4-year payback period. Those 4 things we just repeat over and over again. And I think that's what cuts through, because people can understand that logic. Okay, if you set someone up, put them on a pathway to success, they have housing, they have a job, I can mentally imagine that person and understand that, they are not going to cost the government as much in a range of services, to put it a bit crudely. But then when you put a dollar figure on it, that feels kind of high enough to get them excited, but not too big that they don't believe it. I think that's kind of the sweet spot when you're using numbers in your advocacy. That's when you're sort of in the right space to influence change. And, as I said, in Queensland, I think we're seeing the impacts of that. And hopefully we'll see it in other states.
Fingers crossed. Rebecca, from your perspective, I imagine you work with a whole range of clients, partners around trying to sort of navigate measuring impact.
Yep.
And sifting that through to get some compelling figures or a narrative. So what do you see and what are your observations?
So I think very aligned with a lot of what has just been said, or all of what has just been said. I think the builds would be more on, someone referenced in an earlier panel, like needing that business case, and it actually, it does kind of come down to that when you're working with the government departments and business cases that occur within the political term and that are relevant to the portfolio or the department that you are dealing with, when we know in this instance the benefits span multiple departments. So how, when you're thinking about the impact and that benefit, you look at the benefit from a housing portfolio versus a health portfolio versus a youth justice portfolio, in how you break down and consider those benefits is also, I think, a really key consideration when looking at the potential outcomes. But the most consistent success factor has been looking at the combined ambition, if you will, and then how each part looks to achieve that ambition, because they'll all look at their part in it or how they look to achieve it differently. And I think that's the power of bringing everyone together from all of those departments as well as the people here today, because that then enables you to work towards that same outcome and know, whilst someone might be saying we're building 53,000 houses, and it's almost like, well, so what? How many people is that helping? What's that configuration? What are the wraparound services? But if you put all those questions to one side, and if they can say that and that's what they need to be able to say, but then you can see all the other things that sit alongside it to get you to achieve that overarching ambition as like a broader ecosystem and everyone working together, then they're happy that they've got their component, but you're also achieving that greater good overarching outcome that you're looking for over time.
So flipping that, and it's an open question to the panel around, has something not worked when you're trying to evaluate or develop some measures around outcomes and success? So how did you realise, and I suppose what was the response to that? So it's really an open question to any of the panel that would like to take that.
I can take that. But in the case of zero, I was thinking how we can measure success if we are very far off the zero number, right? Because we are trying to solve homelessness in the middle of a housing crisis. So, however, despite of that, the collaboration of 15 organizations and the data-driven approach has been working for housing in the last financial year, for example, more than 300 families. Most of these families were sole parenting women with more than 500 children in their care. So I know that we are far of success for Reach Out Zero. However, we need to keep working for housing those families and those children experiencing homelessness, that as I said before, they are invisible in our community. If I ask you today, do you think that in Brisbane we have children experiencing homelessness? Probably you will say no, because you don't see them on the streets. However, they are in motels in not suitable conditions. So it is important to keep that in mind when we talk about success, yes, sustained tenancy, but we cannot forget those children experiencing homelessness in motels with sole parenting women. We have some numbers that we have families in motel for more than 18 months. What is that data telling us? And it is not just one or two cases. It is more than a couple. So I leave that open.
Yeah, we're definitely not in a success phase at the moment. Other perspectives?
Maybe a couple of things to share. There are always gaps in data when you're trying to tell a story about impact. And I think you need to be comfortable being creative in the face of those data gaps, but be really upfront about what you see as the limitations in the case you're trying to prosecute. Because it's much better if you point out the holes in it than have someone else do it for you. So I think that's sort of a way to manage one of the challenges I think you face inevitably in collecting data. We are trying to get better at collecting data so that we have an even better understanding of the impact of youth foyers. But that takes a lot of time and a lot of trust. We are working with service providers who have really busy day jobs doing really important things with young people in their services. And we're asking them to set aside some time to share data with us. And that's a big ask, but a really important one. And so we're very grateful that they give the time and share the data with us to allow us to get better in our impact story. But I think you also need to be really sensitive and build a lot of trust in gathering and then how you use that data. Because everybody's naturally really nervous about sharing data and what it might say and how they might get compared. And that's really normal and natural. But I think the more open we can be about what we know, what we don't know, what we're good at, what we are still working on, actually the better we are in being able to understand and tell the story of our impact.
Great point. Any other learnings? And
I was just thinking, building off those couple of conversations, that for us in the outcomes measurement space, we usually sort of focus on services or programs, and in this environment, I think we really need to elevate our gaze and have a stronger focus on the system. There's no single service or government department or organisation that can solve the kinds of issues that we've been talking about today. So it is about joining some of those dots up in how we work together and how we're collectively driving change and impact. And I was thinking about the sort of ladder concept, and if you think of the rungs as services and maybe the system are the arms, is that what it's called, the side bits of the ladder? The service system is the bit that kind of holds all of the services together. And so if we're not focusing on the service system, then we're just looking at the rungs in isolation, and that doesn't tell us what's happening.
Yeah, totally agree with that, and it needs to be that ecosystem approach, I think, is what we've seen again and again, and that's where it's most powerful, because it's not like the services sometimes almost end up in a situation where they're competing, and really both services are needed because they're very targeted and independent requirements that they're looking to address, and more powerful together than alone. I think in terms of the measures, just to finalise that kind of question and what's worked, what hasn't worked, I spoke earlier around the measure that was more academic around economic benefits over a 10-year period, which I tried to answer. I'm not an economist. The economist standing next to me looked panicked and whispered to me, like, that's not right. So, that's not the best. But I did talk to the economists around, like, the career mail test. So it might be getting a bit dated as a concept, but just, is it that number that you can very easily state and explain and people will remember and take away? And I appreciate that. Sometimes it's really hard to reduce it to a number, but it can be one number 1 month, another number another month, as you look at those different aspects that are all kind of contributing to that overarching ambition, and you can show progress in lots of different ways, but you've still got that common tie. Yeah.
And a great point around integrity of that data and information is critical, so that career mail test does stand up. And it's a great segue to, I suppose, the perspective around a systemness. So do we think we can achieve a systems approach to a success matrix? And what are your thoughts around that? It's someone on the phone now. You're right. Anyone want to take us off?
I think yes. I think you got to take the timing is now to do that. I think the appetite is there. I think you've got a change in the political landscape that's also more focused on outcomes and willing to have a conversation on outcomes. And I think just the participation and the show up in the room today. This is you're more than halfway there. Just connecting as an ecosystem. So,
yeah, I think absolutely if we take the time to build the trust and bring people along on the journey. But the reason I say absolutely is no matter what service is supporting a young person or anyone in their experience of homelessness, the needs are pretty universal. Everyone wants safe and stable housing. People need a job that helps them live with dignity. They want connection. They need financial independence. And different services play different roles in helping people towards those outcomes, but they're pretty universal outcomes. So it should be possible to understand how each service makes a contribution to that. But we've also got to be a bit brave in responding to what that tells us as well. Because, it's inevitable everybody gets in their own kind of defensive position of, well, my service does this and I know it works, even though the data might tell me something different sometimes, and it's because there's all this complexity and difference in the cohort. And sometimes that's really true, and people get defensive about what their data says because they've seen governments and others make, I would say, uninformed decisions about what data tells them without understanding the nuance. But at the same time, if we all really care about the outcomes we get for people, we have to be honest that if we're doing something that's not working and the data tells us that, we've got to do something different. And that takes a lot of courage.
Yeah, and bring that trust, it takes time. Brings the collaboration on the table. At least for Zero in Logan and in Brisbane, it has been taking more than 4 years. And when people start to see those outcomes, those housing outcomes, and the competition is out of the table, the work's just becoming encouraging. Yes, we can keep working towards solving homelessness despite of this housing crisis.
Any other perspectives? Otherwise, we're going to go for one last question around the panel. And it is, what does success look like for community and social housing in Queensland? Tamika, do you want to take us off?
Sorry, my alarm got my brain.
No, that's okay.
Apologies, everyone. I will throw out there. I have actually been moving for the last 2 days, so my brain is lost, and that alarm was to remind me to send an email that I didn't send yesterday, so my brain is lost again. So
at least
for me,
you've got the reminder there.
Yes, that's what all my alarms are for. So for me, success. Sorry, could you repeat the question so I can?
Oh, what does success look like for you, and from a community housing perspective in Queensland?
Success for me, like in a community housing perspective, would be for all of us organisations to actually come together and work together rather than against each other. And I do understand funding doesn't help for that because we are all fighting for the same funding bodies and the same funding allowances and different things, but to actually work together and recognise that having a housing model that has everything at the forefront sometimes doesn't work because there's no allowance for communication. So in terms of having one housing service that then does everything, so does the mental health, does does the job support, does the tenancy support, does the financial support and all of those things, that sometimes having the intersections and all of that being at the same space works, but sometimes it can also create difficulties with being able to communicate to those people. So having someone that's supposed to be your support person, that's also your tenancy worker. So then when you get into a situation where, say, there's a hole in the wall or you need support in regards to that, not knowing if you can reach out for that support, because what will happen to your tenancy if you say that to the wrong person. So having people work together, but in a way, because that's a hard one to sort of say, in a way that we can work together but apart. So together but not too closely knit together that can affect other services, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Thank you. Paulina?
Community housing and
social housing.
Social housing. Yeah. Well, it's difficult and tricky to answer that question because, as I mentioned before, so we have so many families in motels right now because there are not stock housing availability for women with more than 2 children. So when I was hearing before that just some units with 1 bedroom or studios can help solve the problem, yes, it can, but it cannot be the only solution. So when I imagine more social housing, I am hoping that also it has this supportive housing embedded within the system because it is needed. And there are different models of supportive housing. So it could be important to still advocating for system change regarding supportive housing.
A great idea. Katie?
I think that when we're operating in a resource-constrained environment like we are at the moment, where the problem seems bigger than the resources we've got to tackle it, it's really important that we're using those resources as effectively as possible and having strong assessment tools and triage tools to really understand people's needs is important so that we can allocate the right supports and invest the right level into people to meet those needs effectively. For some people, that's supportive housing. For others, it's not, so knowing who gets which support, that's tailored to them, I think is critical to using our resources most efficiently and effectively.
I'm going to build on that, and this is my, I guess, dream scenario that I recognise we're a long way from, given all the things we've heard today and the challenge of limited resources. But I think it's ultimately about having a well-connected system of support that gives people what they need, when they need it, in a way that sets them up for independence and thriving futures. And that looks different for each individual at different stages in their lives, but that's ultimately what I think success has to look like. And to get there, that's a lot of different solutions and a lot of connection between those solutions.
And just kind of probably building on that further, and that's defined, transparent, and everyone can access that service catalogue, if you will, to sound more like a consultant, together, what's that holistic ecosystem of things that are available to achieve that outcome, but also that's done in partnership or in collaboration with government, who at a time of short resources and at a time of crisis need to play a certain role as part of those conversations, and can help to hopefully break down some of those barriers that are preventing progress today through unintentional policy or unnecessary barriers to services and those types of things.
And if I could have 10 cents, I think no homelessness would be a great measure of success. So could you please... Could you please thank our amazing panellists for sharing their insights today, particularly in this topic. So thank you.